With that, I'll bring the meeting to order. There are no public questions. Looking to the agenda, are there changes, additions? In which case, I'll move the agenda be approved as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Looking to the minutes of Tuesday, May the 15th. Are there errors or omissions? Seeing none, I'll move the minutes be adopted as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on to the first item, F1, Bylaw 2018-03, Land Use Bylaw Amendment for Cannabis Retail Store. Mr. Fish.
Good afternoon, Your Worship, members of Council.
Councillor Hillstead reminded me he wasn't at the public hearing. He can't vote, but he could still sit in on this discussion, the presentation. Yeah, so when we get to the motion, then you can leave.
Okay, thank you. So, before us here is almost exactly what was approved at first reading and presented at the public hearing. So we are inserting a new definition for cannabis retail stores. Specifically, you can see the definition there: licensed under provincial authority for the sale of any cannabis for consumption off premises. Full walls must physically separate the premise from any other business. Second piece to this, because by defining it, if we don't assign the use to districts, it's effectively prohibiting it. So we have also inserted it to all that new use into all commercial districts and direct control districts, and we've basically been mirroring those districts that allow liquor stores as a discretionary use. So what that looks like, the bylaw amendment itself specifically adds it to all of those districts, but there is it shown graphically across the town. Happy to come back to that at the end if there are any questions. At the public hearing, we heard a number of questions and concerns. There was a suggestion that there should be a maximum number of stores, an increase in separation distances, potentially exclusion from other types of uses. Administration has considered this quite a bit, and there's been a fair bit of discussion. This is primarily an issue that is the responsibility of the province. The province has established the rules with distances and types of uses. So despite the input from the public hearing, at this point administration is not proposing to change the bylaw. Of course, council could make that change now if they wish. There was some discussion as well around limitations around commercial competition, and so right now administration has left it as is, so there are no limitations again on the number of stores, on the separation of stores, or having a maximum number across the community. So we're taking sort of the approach that would let the market decide how many stores can be supported financially in the community. There was also some question about the incompatibility or the concern of incompatibility with residential uses and mixed-use buildings. We've thought about this quite a bit. It was a good point raised at the public hearing. Generally, again, administration has fallen back to the concerns would be similar to that of a liquor store. And so there are some different aspects, primarily regarding the consumption of cannabis, specifically smoking it. But in these mixed-use buildings, these are all condominium buildings, so there are the opportunities for condominiums or landlords to address issues through their own legislation. So administration has left it as is, as it's presented right now. So just sort of in the one other piece that is here is with respect to the definition and just clearly requiring that the requirement or the approval from the Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission, and that would, any conditions from that would also carry over to the town. The one piece that has changed is concern around specifically cannabis retail stores being on a public street. In a number of areas in town, we're trying to have an engaging street front, and some of the provincial regulations could challenge that. So we're looking to work with applicants to maintain a minimum visual interest on the street front. So this is specifically where adjacent to a sidewalk. So if it's in a larger retail complex and it's not immediately adjacent, then there's less of a concern. But on Main Street, 10th Street, Railway Avenue, we want that permeability, that interest, visual interest, especially to pedestrians. So this is a proposed amendment that is in the bylaw that is presented in the package. So just in conclusion, I guess there's no other requirements being proposed. There's no separation distance between retail cannabis stores or liquor stores. And at this time, we're not proposing any restriction to the operating hours. Those are established by the provincial government. So just talking about the provincial government, I did say AGLC has implemented a number of separation distances, 100 meters from the lot of schools and hospitals. So what does that look like? Downtown in Canmore, we're adjacent to the Lawrence Grassy Middle School site. I know there's a lot of red in this image, but here's the school site here, and 100 meters from that is the sort of darkest red. For illustrative purposes only, we've shown what 150 meters looks like, as well as what 200 meters could look like. The edge of the town center land use district is shown here in blue, so that's sort of the edge of commercial uses. Similarly, at Elizabeth Rummel School, you can see there is the 100-meter buffer that comes just to the edge of the Summit Center lot here, the local commercial district. If the separation requirement were 150 meters, you would reach out to the far end of that parking lot there. But the 100-meter would have little to no impact at that point. Moving out to Our Lady of the Snows, École Notre-Dame-des-Monts, again, there are no commercial zoned properties within 100 or even 150 meters of that. There is the Three Sisters Commercial Gateway District across the parkway here, but at 100 or even 150, if it were changed to that, would not be impacted. The hospital is a little bit more interesting because there are a number of commercial properties that are impacted by the 100-meter separation from the lot. So the lot is highlighted in this sort of purpley color here. The land use district for Bow Valley Trail Central is here. So these are all commercial properties on this side here, or mixed use in some cases. So all of these properties within the red area would be excluded from being eligible. Now the town can apply, as we understand, to AGLC for a relaxation of that 100-meter separation if we felt it were warranted. This map, again, it's a little hard to see, but the entrance, well, actually that's, if I recall, that's sort of the emergency entrance closest. You can see what 100 meters looks like from that. The provincial regulations are clear that it's 100 meters from the lot, not from the entrance of the facility, but should the town feel that this property was appropriate or this property was appropriate, we potentially could argue that it's actually more like 300 meters or 150 meters from the entrance of the building, and we could apply for relaxation to that. At this case, though, we're not specifically proposing that. We're maintaining the 100 meters from the hospital lot. Just a couple of slides, not what is being proposed here, but just for information purposes. If there were a 100-meter separation requirement between stores, if we look at the downtown area and imagine seven somewhat randomly selected lots, we have a vacant parking lot here, we have a vacant property here, we have an old house here, essentially vacant, police barracks, Bank of Montreal, the post office, and the Legion, just as an example, not saying that any of these would be eligible or appropriate as a cannabis retail store, but you can see how you could get as many as 7 retail stores, cannabis retail stores in the downtown area. So what that bubble around those sites is 50 meters. So you sort of need 2 of those 50-meter bubbles to achieve the 100-meter separation. So you can see that in this scenario, if those 7 businesses were operating, it would not be possible to operate one out of the Canmore Hotel or the Stonewaters building or the Dollar Shop, any of those other, the Telus phone store, any of those retail outlets would not be eligible with 100-meter separation. But you could have as many as 7. If that separation requirement were increased to 200 meters, you would effectively have the potential for only 2 cannabis retail stores in the downtown area. You can see again, this is just an example of two lots that were used, and that to put another effective bubble that same size in there, you couldn't get it in. So it would effectively set a maximum at 2 stores in the downtown area. So, as I said, those are just for illustration purposes.
Sorry, Mr. Fish, the first map was 50 meters, right?
It's actually 100 meters. It's not very intuitive. They're shown as 50-meter bubbles around each one, because then it would have its own bubble around it. So if at the parking lot there was a cannabis retail store here and you wanted to open one here, you could, because
so
that's 50 meters and that's
if
50.
There was a 50-meter rule.
This is the effect if there were a 100-meter separation rule.
So take the middle bubble that the mouse is on, the building in the middle shows vacant.
Yes.
The outside of the bubble is 100 meters from that building?
Is 50 meters to
So
that point.
That's a 50-meter bubble then?
Yes.
That's what I said.
Okay. So
but it's a 50-meter bubble.
this is,
shows the 50
it's a
meter.
50-meter buffer around the property. Yeah. Yes. So it is 100 meters from this edge to this edge.
Yeah. Right, thank you.
So, in conclusion, based on all of that, administration is recommending that council give second and third reading to bylaw 2018-03, the land use bylaw amendment for cannabis retail stores as amended with that addition.
There's a couple of things I wanted to just discuss before there's a motion on the table, so you're welcome to stay for that. So talk briefly about the intent, or the section 2 indicates that storefronts would maintain visual interest at the pedestrian scale. And can you give some examples of what you would have in mind when to interpret that? Yeah,
at a very worst case scenario, there are a few instances in town where we have allowed some graphics to be used on what was intended as a storefront, but has, for various reasons, ended up as storage or not an effective storefront to the building, not a frontage to the building. So you can see examples of that at on Railway Avenue. There are a couple of businesses there. So rather than having an entirely blank wall, there is some visual interest there. At worst case, that's what we would consider. The provincial regulations don't allow product display. They also don't, I understand, allow lifestyle advertising. I think I'm not familiar with the details of it, but it's somewhat similar to advertising of liquor. You need to be careful about how the product is portrayed. So that's where we're trying to work to have as visually interesting, but the province is trying to not have it as enticing as possible.
So visually permeable would suggest that you couldn't simply put a poster or a piece of art or something in the window. That wouldn't be permeable. I mean, galleries, for instance, will build a false wall 3 feet behind behind the window and hang art there. But so that's visually interesting, but it's not visually permeable. Well, the window is.
So the window is. So there is something to engage the viewer as they pass by. Okay. Some of these stores that I have walked past only in British Columbia, the entire storefront is basically covered over with just white.
Yeah,
I don't know how they've done it. And
other jurisdictions in Alberta have interpreted the regulations in that way, that the window has to be painted over. It doesn't actually say that in the regulation, though, does it? The Alberta regulation.
It does not say that.
Yeah. So this interpretation, or this is a way of responding to the provincial regulations, but still allowing for some interest if there was a shop on Main Street.
Correct.
And if the no, I think that's all I need to ask about that particular issue. Thanks. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. I did have one question for you after your presentation regarding the mixed-use buildings. And if you own a condo in one of those buildings, do the condo rules affect the whole building, or do you only manage the condo units that are sold to the residents? So do you make rules for the commercial part of the building too?
Depend on how the condominium bylaws are structured, but as a condominium entity, there would be a number of the bylaws would apply across. I'm not sure if you could, within those bylaws, limit it to units 1 to 10 for an example that might be commercial, and then units 11 to 100 that are the residential units on top. If different rules could apply, I'm not sure if you could, but the fact that it is a condominium would require the agreement of the condominium through that process.
So you're suggesting...
Sorry, Mr. Fark had something to add to that.
So yes, a condominium corporation can have separate rules for commercial and residential if they both exist within the same building, right? Because the set of rules would not apply, rules for commercial would not apply to residential properties. So you couldn't have a cannabis retail business in a residential unit, but you could have one potentially in a commercial unit, and the condo corporation would have the option to prohibit that use in a commercial unit.
Okay, so the question I think I'm asking is that would that condo association have the ability to control what goes into the commercial aspect of the building?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so you're suggesting that they could control the licensing in the whole building, including the commercial section?
Not the licensing, but to give a parallel example, we have tourist home as a possibility in some condo corporations. A condo corporation can include in their bylaws that short-term rentals are not permitted, right? So they can control the use, right? And so similarly, they could pass a bylaw, or they could include in their bylaws that cannabis retail would not be permitted.
In that commercial part of the building?
That's correct.
Okay, all right, just to clarify that, because that was a thing we heard at the hearing, the public hearing, so that's something that's within their control of the condo corporation.
Yes.
Okay.
Bound by condominium laws.
Right.
So
yes.
There's a voting process and things like that.
So that would require their political will to determine what the uses of their commercial spaces are.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And that would be the same of any commercial building that's privately owned. The landlord could arbitrarily reject this use or that use within the building. And that would be, specific in the leasing. Are you done? I remembered where my thoughts were roaming, and they were towards Rome. So the window treatment on the Rome bus, would you deem that as meeting the wording of this regulation, visually permeable? Because they are visually permeable.
Yeah.
You can look through them, but you can also, from the outside, perhaps see what's for sale inside. So
we would hope to achieve something a little more permeable than that, but if that's the best that we could, especially because we're in a bit of a learning here where the provincial regulations are not, there's not a long history of understanding what those limitations are, perhaps that would be an acceptable solution. Yes, I would hope for something more akin to your description of a piece of art set in a window that's recessed, display area that's recessed 3 feet. I think that would be much more interesting than something right on the surface, but
sure.
Something to look at other than a blank wall.
Great. Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Fish. So, can we talk a minute about discretionary use and what the process is so the public can understand how a discretionary use can or cannot be used?
Yes.
Take it away.
Great. So there are permitted uses, which is basically as long as the application complies with the bylaw, the Development Authority must issue the approval for it, as long as it meets things like parking requirements or other requirements. A discretionary use is more of an it depends. The Development Authority would look at relevant issues. I think most importantly where you're getting at is we require a notice to be posted on the site for 10 days in advance to receive input from the public. If they have comments on it, to assist in issues that the Development Authority may not have been aware of. So there is the opportunity for public input as part of that process with a discretionary use. The Development Authority can then render a decision. We're not bound to approving it, even if it does meet all the requirements, but any refusal would need to be based on sound planning rationale.
Right. And then if the decision of the planning department, of the development officer, wasn't appreciated by one of the parties, then what happens?
Then one of the parties would be able to appeal that as long as they could demonstrate that they were an affected person.
Right.
Yeah.
Perfect. So there is a public process that's
yes.
around a discretionary
yes.
use. And so, and this is how I understand it, so please correct me if I'm a child of Ontario, so we had like the beer store, and there was a brick that you walked into and ordered things off a conveyor belt. So liquor and cannabis retail, those permits or those licenses are actually permitted by the provincial government. So I can't, it's not like I want to open a furniture store and you know, if there's 100 furniture stores in town, it doesn't matter. The province is actually the one that's going to be providing those licenses, correct?
For the, yes, for liquor stores and for the cannabis retail stores, yes.
I've been up since 2:30 this morning from Halifax,
that's okay.
so I'm a little cross-eyed.
So yes, so we would require, and a little bit, we run into this with the liquor stores as well, as we require confirmation from the province that they have approval. The province also requires municipal approval, so there's a bit of a chicken and an egg thing.
Interesting.
So we work through that. There's sort of an approval in principle from the province. We give the approval, we sort of finish it up with paperwork at the end, and there's never been an issue there.
Okay, thank you. And do you, the condo board was a question I had. An example of a building with visual interest, would that be, say, like the Sports Experts on Railway Ave with the pictures of people?
Yes, that is an example
outside.
of where we would prefer something permeable into the store.
Gotcha.
But that is something that we agreed upon as an acceptable solution.
Gotcha. And then just to confirm what Councillor Sanford had asked, so condominium board, we could say, yes, you could have a cannabis retail store in this district, but the condominium board ultimately has the ultimate say as to whether they want that in their building or not.
Yes.
Mr.
Yes.
Fish, Mr. Park has
So,
fa-fa-fa.
as is often the case, the condominium corporation has the option to be more restrictive than the town, but not less restrictive. So if the town denies the application or does not permit the use, then the condominium corporation cannot then decide, well, they want it anyway.
Gotcha.
However, if the town gave it as a discretionary use, the condominium corporation could be more restrictive and indicate that they do not permit that use within their building.
Gotcha.
And so I think where this is coming from is that we have a number of direct control districts. Some are commercial districts and some are mixed-use districts. And we have liquor stores as essentially a discretionary use in a number of those direct control districts. So we had two options in terms of how to treat this issue administratively. The first is that we could have gone through and essentially had council debate and discuss district by district, which ones they would approve it to be discretionary and which ones not. That would have been a heavier process. The alternative was we treat it exactly as we treat liquor stores, which is it becomes discretionary in all districts, and then the public process and the application process that Mr. Fish just described would come into play. It's a simpler and cleaner administrative process than trying to debate district by district. However, council would have the option, if there are some of the direct control districts that they have identified that they would prefer not to have this as a discretionary use, you could go through and you could amend and remove those districts.
Thank you, Mr. Park. Thank you, Mr. Fish.
And on that note, that's where I was going next. So in looking at the bylaw, and it's helpful to have that explanation of why it is that the bylaw just essentially picks out every district. Essentially what I'm hearing is planning is leaving it up to council to agree whether it's every district that should be amended or not. So there's 4 districts in particular that I'm questioning the value of including in the bylaw, and they're all very specific. For instance, under provision 2.12, it's talking about the section 3.23.3 of the land use bylaw for which is the Palliser Perpetually Affordable Housing Department DC district, which is effectively one building and an empty field. So it's the hectare, 60 units of hectare PAH rental, and the undeveloped field across. Well, now it's a temporary use as a off-leash dog park, if I recall. But so there's a very good expectation that empty field will be developed as more affordable housing units. And well, I appreciate that should the time come when somebody, if CCHC were to develop a building there that had commercial in it, which is a bit of an if, but if it does, there would be discretion on the part of council, because it's a DC district, whether or not to allow cannabis in that building. But part of me is thinking that we should just say now whether we think it's a good idea and pull that section out of the bylaw. Similar consideration around section 2.14, which is referring to section 3.25 of the land use bylaw, which is in the same area as the Blackiston building. That's all that's in that district is that Blackiston building, and I don't think there's even any space in that building that's available for retail. And section 2.17 or provision 2.17 in the bylaw, referencing section 3.35.3 of the land use bylaw, which is Palliser Mustache Rental Apartment District Control District, or Direct Control District. So that's the Northview project, which does have potential of a bit of commercial. I'm not sure if the developer is exercising that. No, so there'll be, the whole building will be established as residential. So those three particularly, I'm thinking council could just use our discretion at this point and say, not include those in the bylaw, and that could be done through an amending motion. I'm going to ask you to speak to those three, and then the fourth one is provision 2.13 in the bylaw, which references the section 3.24.3, the TC1 Town Center Creekside DC District, which I think is only the ISL building.
It's actually only 1/3 of what is the Bow Valley was the Bow Valley Motel, and now is the Lamp House Hotel redivision.
I thought it was the ISL building.
No.
Okay, don't want to argue with you. I got you manager of planning. You should know. So if that's the old Bow Valley Motel, that puts a different slant on it. But the other three sections that I referenced, do you have any perspective, feedback on where I'm going with that?
No, I don't think there's any concern with that. I mean, as talked about, we just looked at where the liquor stores were allowed. All three of those buildings, as you noted, are intended to be fully residential. It would not prevent them from converting some of the most likely ground floor residential units into commercial units.
Which would defeat our purpose.
Possible, but it's difficult. Yeah, I think the rationale for including that commercial there is that there could be the potential for some services for residents to come down and utilize, ideally a convenience store type function. Store would make sense. But whatever one desires for their convenience, perhaps.
Residents could probably go a little further afield to get the cannabis. So I'm just thinking. Councillor Sanford. Got this board in my reverse.
Thank you. I just had another question for you about the not regulating the distance between stores. Is that, or will it discourage people from seeking multiple licenses or multiple development applications? Because one of the concerns I think we heard at the public hearing was that somebody could buy up all the permits in a region and then just let them not be used and just have one store. So does that discourage that practice?
I think it keeps us out of trying to guess what might or might happen in the marketplace. Yeah, I mean, it's
so
all... So
people won't be seeking multiple development permits to acquire a monopoly on the service in a particular region because there's no setback.
I would think that that's correct. We would, by not having a separation distance, it goes around that possibility.
And so the discretion is still with the planning department to allow the services where people are applying for them.
Yes.
Without one person being able to buy up a monopoly in one area because they own all the permits. Okay.
Yes.
With your visually permeable concept, does that include like etched glass that says, cannabis store? The light is going through, but you can't see actually what's behind the glass?
So the key is visual interest and acknowledging that it's subjective, but the idea is to have something of interest other than a blank wall and the name of the store, perhaps.
So etched
hopefully
glass
there would be
wouldn't...
something more interesting than that. There is an example where an office moved into a main floor retail. It was intended as retail, and it's now offices. So in that case, we agreed to some etched glass, but only for a portion of the windows. So there was some permeability, but also some privacy. So it's a bit of a balancing act. It's a bit of an art. It's not as much of a science. We just are trying to have it as visually interesting as possible for folks as they walk down the street. So
it's not so much light permeable, but
it's
something to look at.
Correct. Yes.
Something to look at. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I just wanted to, can I ask you a question about your musing over your amendment? Okay. So I just want to confirm, because it was at the public hearing, I recall it being brought up that there was concern about cannabis retail being allowed in the Palliser district. And I think it was a misunderstanding of what actually affordable housing there is. It's not social housing. And so I just wanted to make sure that that's not the reason for your amendment. It's more about it's fully residential. So if there were any fully other residential buildings that were on this list, you would probably set those aside as well?
That's my logic, yes.
Okay, so it has nothing to do with who's living in those homes. It has to do with the odds of it actually being retail.
Yeah,
Okay.
basically. I mean, as I've noted, we could leave them in and then wait till somebody should perhaps apply, and the future council could use discretion at that time, but I'm just arguing, or I might argue that we can exercise that discretion now and simply not include those 3 districts in the change.
And so the attainable housing, the Blackiston, that's not controlled by CCHC at all. So would we be in effect, like, can I ask a question through the chair to administration? Mr. Fish, so would we be in effect sort of unleveling a playing field for that particular building, since they're not, we can't really predict what they might want to do in the future with their ground floor units? They could convert a residential unit into a commercial unit down the road, and there would be a whole other process that they would be required to go through that they wouldn't be required to go through, that other similar buildings in town would not have been required to go through?
So you're correct that by removing them from this bylaw amendment, if they wanted to pursue that route, there is a different, they would need to go through the land use bylaw amendment process. So the logic of following the liquor stores is one approach that administration is taking, but zoning is itself inherently uneven or unequal.
No, I'm trying to figure out if we're making, we are potentially putting roadblocks in, and I have no idea if that's even, they would ever want to put any kind of retail in there, but clearly liquor store is a discretionary use in that building. Yeah. And we wouldn't make them jump through extra hoops down the road if they were to decide to convert, but we're going to make them jump through extra hoops for something, and I get it, like there's no precedent in planning, I understand that, but I'm just trying to understand why we would assume what we think their future looks like when we don't have any control over that building.
And I don't think Mr. Fish has an answer for that.
No, I'm just
but
trying to, okay, sure you do, Your Worship.
And part of, and we're sort of getting into the debate now. Maybe
no, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah. I mean, those buildings specifically were developed largely through council direction, specifically for housing. And the likelihood of commercial in any of those 3 buildings that I referenced, and certainly in the Blackiston, there is no space there that would be suitable for commercial unless they remove one of the units from the housing pool.
Which I'm pointing out is a possibility.
Sure, but I'm saying I don't think that's a good idea. We struggled to get the housing unit there in the first place. There were provincial grants, you know, but we can debate that later if you like.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Fish at this time? Seeing none, thanks very much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
Then I will at this time move the council give second reading to bylaw 2018-03, the land use bylaw amendment for cannabis retail store as amended. And I'll put forward an amending motion, which is to remove, and I don't have it written, but it's pretty straightforward, remove provisions 2.12, 2.14, and 2.17 from the bylaw. 2.12, 2.14, and 2.17, those are the three provisions that I spoke with Mr. Fish about. So specifically the Hector building, the Blackiston building, and the Northview building. Oh, right, you gotta leave now. So there's an amendment on the table. Is there discussion? Councillor McCallum?
I'd like to move that you split those, please, Your Worship.
Okay. So the first amending motion would be to remove section or provision 212 from the bylaw. Discussion on that motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. I'll move an amendment then to remove provision 2.14 from the bylaw. Discussion on that motion. And that would be the Blackiston, Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I would not be voting in favor of pulling that. Those are privately owned condos. They have no restrictions through the town of Canmore whatsoever. They have their own condo board. And although I understand that the council of the day went through a lot of hoops to be able to have those built as attainable housing, as Mr. Fish pointed out, they'd be a discretionary use and they would be granted based on good planning rationale. So therefore, I wouldn't be able to support that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just note for the debate that that building particularly, and of course it was intended to be perpetually affordable housing, but there was a significant amount of public tax dollars that went into the building initially, and the land was contributed by the province, if I'm not mistaken. So there was quite a public, the building wouldn't exist without the public contribution, and it was solely intended to provide housing to meet our needs. So I think in the spirit of those initial grants and approvals, this council could be saying that it's for residential, it's not for commercial. Councillor?
And in the spirit of debate, Your Worship, none of those grants actually hold to that building. It is a market building. It is subject to the market. And so if we can, unless we're willing and interested in pulling all the other commercial uses as discretionary uses away from that building, I don't see the point of not adding this one as a discretionary use, since we're going into the principle of lining up liquor store uses with cannabis retail store uses.
Okay. Further discussion on the amending motion? Councillor Sanford?
Thank you, Worship. Well, if we're not going to remove the use of liquor store in that particular building, I don't know why we would remove one thing. So if there is still commercial potential in that building for a liquor store, and we're following along with cannabis, then I would say that it would make sense to keep it, as Councillor McCallum suggests, that it's a privately owned building and that they could make condo rules about it if they wanted to. So I would not support this one.
Is there any other discussion on the amending motion? Councillor Seeley?
I'm leaning not to support it as well for the reasons that Councillor McCallum and Sanford noted. If it has retail opportunities and it's discretionary, I think that's the way I would cite.
Just for the sake of the record, I'll once again note that there is no space in the building that's suitable for commercial at this time. A residential unit would have to be taken out of the residential pool, in fact bought by the condo association from the owner, and then rezoned. So it's not like there's an empty space or a space that's already used for retail there. And if the condo board was interested in having a convenience store or something else that may have better justification, then that's still permitted under the land use bylaw. It's only, this is adding in cannabis. And I wouldn't, at this point, support taking one of those units out of the housing inventory simply for the sake of having cannabis retail in the building. Is there further discussion on the amending motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion defeated by tie. And then I'll put forward the amending motion to remove provision 2.17 from the land use bylaw, or from this bylaw, which is specifically the Northview project. Discussion on that motion. Councillor McCallum.
Your worship, I will not be able to support pulling this as well from the list for the similar rationales I provided for the Blackiston. Though they have PAH obligations on 40 of those units, there are also 108 market units of varying types. And if the developer decided that they wanted to pull a unit, that's their prerogative. We've already approved liquor stores in that building, as well as a small list of other discretionary uses. I wouldn't want to set an uneven playing field in terms of that. Again, they are market units.
Further discussion on the amending motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's defeated. Moving then back to the main motion as amended. There was only one successful amendment. It's the motion then that council gives second and third reading the bylaw, or second reading the bylaw 2018-03, the land use bylaw amendment. You have another amendment? Councillor Seeley. Are we waiting for something here?
Yeah.
Are we waiting for something here?
Yeah. So speaking to the amendment, I'd like to add this. At the cannabis retail public hearing, Dr. Friesen from Alberta Health Services requested a more restrictive approach beyond the provincial requirements. One of his recommendations was a 10 p.m. public hearing. Dr. Friesen from Alberta Health Services more restrictive approach. Addiction beyond also supported a 10 p.m. One of his recommendations informed council that by staggering the closing hours, second Alberta Health Services stores and bars would help minimize the chance. Also supported a 10 p.m. One of his recommendations informed council that by staggering the closing hours, second Alberta Health Services stores and bars would help minimize the chance. Also supported a 10 p.m. One of his recommendations informed council that by staggering the closing hours, second Alberta Health Services stores and bars would help minimize the chance.
Question through the chair to administration. What are our current hours for the stores and
bars would help
minimize the question through the chair to
Off the top of my head, we
what are
have
our
not
current hours
restricted
for the
it.
stores and
I'm not sure if there's any provincial regulation.
question through the chair to
Off the top of my head, we
what are our
have not
current hours
restricted
for the
it.
stores and
I'm not sure if there's any provincial regulation.
question through the chair to
Off the top of my head, we
what are our
have not
current hours?
restricted it.
So I'll speak to that. I'd like to propose a friendly amendment that it 10 to 11.
Off the top of
That's what
my
I said.
head, we
What are our
have not
current hours?
restricted it.
So I'll speak to that. I'd like to propose a friendly amendment that it 10 to 11.
Off the top of
That's what
my
I said.
head, we
What are our
have not
current hours?
So you're accepting that as a friendly
I'll speak to
amendment?
that.
Your amendment?
I'd like to propose a friendly amendment that it 10 to 11.
Off the top of my head, we
What are our
have not
current hours?
So you're accepting that as a friendly
Also to
amendment?
that,
Your amendment?
I'd like to
An amendment to the amendment?
amendment to the amendment that the closing time be 11. That's what I said. And I get the
So you're
rationale.
accepting that as a
I'm
friendly
down. Also
amendment?
to that, I'd like to better tell
An amendment to the amendment?
amendment to the amendment and the closing time be 11. That's what I said.
Okay, speaking
And I
to
get the rationale.
accepting that
I'm
as
down.
Councillor
Also to
McCallum's
that,
amendment?
I'd like to better tell
Amendment to the amendment?
amendment to the amendment
Anybody
and
wish to speak to that?
closing time be 11. That's what I said.
Okay, speaking
And I
to
get the
the
rationale.
screen,
I'm down.
Councillor
Also to
McCallum's
that,
amendment?
I'd like to better tell
Amendment to the amendment?
amendment to the amendment
Okay,
and
Councillor Comfort.
Okay,
Okay, speaking
And I
to
get the
the
I don't think I
screen,
can support that. I think we're going to restrict the hours for cannabis, we should probably restrict them. I don't think I can support that. I think we're going to restrict 30 hours for the health base. We should probably restrict them. Happy to try. I don't think I can support that. See how we're going to restrict 30 hours. It is a concern. Happy to try. I don't think I can support that. See how we're going to restrict 30 hours.
Councillor McCallum's amending motion. Councillor McCallum.
Happy to try.
I'll just follow that. I found it a very compelling speech as well, but as the
Councillor McCallum's amending motion.
top dog medically in the province of Alberta, I'll just follow that. I found it a very government speech as well, but by it, so that's why I'm looking at aligning it with what regular liquor store hours are. Top dog medically, and not all liquor stores Alberta. I'll just follow that are open very government, but on the whole, it's by it, so that's why I'm talking about making like regular liquor store hours. That's sort of and not all liquor stores Alberta. I'll just follow that are open very government, but on the whole, it's by it, so that's why I'm talking about making like regular liquor store hours.
The reason I'm not going to
Not all
support
liquor
this
stores Alberta. I'll just follow that are open very government, but on the whole, it's by it, so that's why I'm talking about making like regular liquor store hours.
the reason I'm not going to
Not all
support
liquor
this
stores Alberta. I'll just follow that are open very government, but on the whole, it's by it, so that's why I'm talking about
Discussion on Councillor McCallum's.
not all liquor stores Alberta. I'll just follow
Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favour? Opposed? Discussion on Councillor back then to Councillor Seely's. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favour to amend retail cannabis hours of operation. Discussion on Councillor back then to Councillor Seely's. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favour to amend retail discussion on that. Discussion on Councillor amendment back then to Councillor Seely's. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favour to those in favour. Discussion on that. Opposed? Motion is carried. Amendment back then to Councillor Seely's. The primary motion again. Those in favor. Discussion has been made several times now. To give second reading bylaw 2018-03. Discussion on that motion as amended. I'll speak briefly. I'll be supporting second reading. There's a lot of discussion in the community, in some quarters concern about how this may roll out, but honestly, I think there's a lack of certainty. We're kind of stepping into new turf here, and I think we're moving forward cautiously. But once places cannabis retail is happening, and we can see how it plays out in the community, we have the option of bringing the land use bylaw back for some more tweaking if we feel that's necessary. I think the amendments that this council is proposing are quite reasonable and a reasonable way of moving forward into this unknown turf. So I will support second reading of the bylaw. Anybody else? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. Some of us attended FCM in Halifax recently, and there was a cannabis session held at 7 a.m. on Sunday morning. And some of us went. We took one for the team. And one thing that came across loud and clear at that session from municipalities across the country is that we're all dealing with unknown terrain. We don't know exactly what we're planning for. And people have put lots of thought and lots of ideas into how we're going to roll this out and how we're going to make this successful in our communities. And we may have to take another stab at it because this might not be the be-all and end-all planning solution. So I think what we've come up with so far to regulate the retail aspect of it is quite reasonable. And I think that as things change or as things develop, we can modify our approach. But I think we're all dealing with the uncertainty. So I think administration has done a very good job bringing forward recommendations and looking at, how we can put this into the public realm relatively efficiently and be ready for whatever happens, whenever it happens, because we don't exactly know when the legislation is going to roll out. So I'm satisfied that we have taken a good look at it, and we'll go from there. But thank you very much.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. I'll then move that council give third reading to bylaw 2018-03, the land use bylaw amendment for cannabis retail store. Discussion on that motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Could we get Councillor Hillstead back down, and we'll move on to item G1. Who's presenting this? Mr. Fark.
Good evening, Mayor Borman, members of council. I'm before you this evening to talk about the potential purchase of land at 630 10th Street. So the recommendation before council is that council approve the purchase of 630 10th Street, which has an appraised value of $1.615 million, but to be purchased for $1.25 million, funded by debt, with a tax receipt for $365,000 to be issued to the seller. And further, that council acknowledge that the purpose of purchasing the property is to convert it to a park. Should council approve the above motion, administration recommends that the following motions be passed related to how to essentially pay for said property. One is to give first reading to a debenture borrowing bylaw 2018-11 for the acquisition of said property. The second is that council direct administration to assume the 2018 property taxes for said property. And the third, that council approve a new 2018 capital project entitled Policeman Creek Park Design, which would provide $50,000 to do the design for the eventual municipal park. And that would be funded from the cash in lieu of municipal reserve. So, and in this case, I use the term recommendation loosely.
It's actually just the recommended wording for a motion.
For the motion, indeed. So a little bit of background for council. Council does have a land acquisition policy. So as a result of recent other mishaps in the town, any offer to sell land to the town must be brought to council for a decision. So in this particular case, an offer was brought to the town of the sale of this land to the town. So we are doing that. The land acquisition policy also states that we should make decisions based on best value for money. And not pay more than fair market value for the property. So there is a condition that the landowner is trying to place on the sale of the property to the town, and that is that that parcel of land can only be used for a park. So that we are clear about the parcel that we are referring to, it is there highlighted in yellow. It is at the essentially north corner of 10th Street, bordering on Policeman's Creek. This is the approximate size of the parcel. It is 100 meters of frontage on the creek, and then it borders 10th Street and 6th Avenue. We did an assessment today, and this is a bit of a rough assessment as to the developability of the parcel for purposes other than a park. So the land is zoned town center district. So that allows for a number of commercial or mixed uses on that parcel. However, there is a 20-meter setback from the creek that is required in the land use bylaw, and that 20-meter setback, based on the orthophoto from the GIS, is essentially the purple line, leaving the developable land as the corner at the front. There is also a 1-meter front yard setback, so the remaining land is less than 300 meters of space that could be potentially developed. Now, bear in mind, of course, that the 20-meter setback is in the land use bylaw, so a variance, in theory, could be possibly granted if it were to be applied for. But in principle, there is the 20-meter setback. And further to the 20-meter setback, which is a land use bylaw requirement, I would remind council of the experience we had when we assessed the Fairholme Drive property, which is across the street from the Seniors Lodge. And there we did a similar assessment to determine the developability of that property. And in addition to the 20-meter setback, the province has an additional 50-meter recommended setback for sensitive creeks and wetlands. And so the town made the decision at that time that we would not pursue further development on that parcel in order to respect the setting the standard for appropriate development.
Before you move on, do you mind some questions on that specific?
Happy to.
Of course, across the road from there, there's a building that was approved not that long ago through variances. So there,
Yes.
has anything changed in any regulations that would disallow, I think it was Planning Commission that approved those variances that's on the ISL building right across 10th Street.
Right.
Is there anything changed in regulations that would prohibit Planning Commission from approving variances and allowing for a larger footprint on that property?
Right. So what has changed is the provincial guidelines, which suggest larger setbacks for sensitive water areas and water sources, but it is a guideline, it is not actually regulation. So in theory, the Planning Commission could approve a variance to allow increased development size. I believe that the town would probably not be supportive of that position, but that's only speculation on my part.
So there's no certainty that development would be constrained to that small corner.
The intent of the land use bylaw obviously is to set regulation. There is an option for variance, so there is no certainty, but the bylaw intent is to constrain development only to the remaining triangle.
Thanks.
So these are some pictures of the parcel. It is quite a beautiful piece of land, that is undeniable. There are 3 buildings that are on the property, existing buildings. One of them, which is the garage and part of the fence, is non-conforming currently, so they are grandfathered in, but they would not be permitted under future development. So some additional information for you. There's the assessed value, which is the tax assessed value, places the value of the property at $961,900. We did a market assessment of the property as zoned at Town Center District at $1.615 million. However, the market value as assessed at MR, which is essentially what would be appropriate for a park, is $165,000. If we were to move forward with the purchase, the funding, $1.25 million, would come from debt. We would then, in addition, accrue $481,000 in interest on servicing that debt over the life of the debt servicing. There's a requirement for a tax receipt of $365,000, also to the benefit of the owner, so that he can use that as a tax write-off. Property taxes, the town would be responsible for taking on the property taxes essentially from the time of the decision of council through to the balance of the year, given that we will need to take some time to get the borrowing bylaw in effect. So this is a fairness component for the landowner, and it's for $2,900, $2,901, which is oddly specific. Design, so purchasing the parcel is the first step. The next step is we would actually have to invest some money in designing it to be a park. And then there's an estimate on what the construction, well, first of all, the demolition and then construction cost would be to convert it into a park. The $320,000 is an estimate only at this point, and it would come back to council at a future point for a decision on when and how much would be allocated for that particular project. We are proposing to move forward with the 50,000 in design now so that we could bring to council a more specific number on which to base decision-making.
Yeah, I have a question, and maybe it'll fit in later, but it's around the process that may or may not be required to dedicate it as park, but you can talk about that later.
I can answer that now. So within the town center district, park is a permitted use. So there's no land use change that is required to designate this a park. Essentially, with this, if council approves this motion, we have land use in place. The town could immediately move to converting this into a park. You could place an MR designation on the land as additional protection for it, but it is not required. And in this particular case, administration would not recommend doing so. It's not necessary to convert it into a park, and it would essentially fetter a future council's discretion in terms of what could be done with the land in a way that if you're going to pay market value for a property, you should have the discretion. Future councils should have the discretion to treat it as they deem appropriate.
Just to be clear, the offer is not at market value, it's below market value.
Well, it is, yes. The mayor and I should not engage in a debate. The numbers are as they indicate there, which is at town center district, it is below that, the asking price. At park value, it is above market value, and it is above the assessed value.
Councillor Comfort, did you have a question?
I do on that matter. On the condition that the owner has, that it'll be designated as a park, we can't, I don't believe that it's possible to designate it as a park in perpetuity. No,
that is correct. The strongest action that council could take would be to provide it with an MR designation. MR is a designation, it's not a land use. So you could provide an MR designation. What that would in effect do is that if a future council wished to develop it in a different way, they would actually have to go through the process of removing the MR designation, which involves, I believe it involves a public hearing. It does involve a public hearing, right?
We've been through it recently.
Yes, we have. And any proceeds from the disposition would then be restricted in terms of their use, right? So you couldn't, if the town at some future date wanted to sell it as an asset for development and redirect those funds for another purpose, they would be unable to do so outside of the specific uses that the MGA sets out for municipal reserve. And so that would be to acquire additional recreation facilities, that sort of purpose. Council should also be familiar with that because you voted on a motion recently on how to use your MR cash in lieu.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
So the reasons to purchase. It is park-like now. There are mature trees, and it is attractive along Policeman's Creek. That is absolutely clear. It would preserve the land in a somewhat natural state, although there, like I said, there are 3 buildings there. It would provide additional pedestrian space in the town center, another location to host weddings, or, well, we don't know yet what the consumption rules around cannabis will be, but that could be a possibility as well, and protect the creek and the shoreline.
Just while that slide's up there, it occurs to me another, arguably a reason to consider purchasing the land is it might also make a good location for an additional public washroom in the downtown center, which is the BRZ, the downtown merchants are keen on, and arguably might be a location for a future visitor info center. I mean, it's in good location for. So those are other reasons that I think we could consider as opportunities.
Sure, there could be future opportunities there. I mean, one of the arguments that council or that administration is making to not proceed with this now is that we actually have not done the downtown enhancement plan, which is scheduled to take place in 2019, and would inform, for example, decisions around where to locate a potential downtown VIC if one were to be desirable, and also washrooms. It's difficult to speculate on. I mean, there's a fair bit of foot traffic that goes by that location for sure. Whether or not it would be a natural location for a VIC, for example, is something we would have to assess further. And similarly, whether it would be an appropriate location for additional public washrooms is something we would have to assess further.
Absolutely.
So reasons not to purchase. It is, by the time you purchase the property and the closing costs and then the cost to convert it into a park, there is close to, or it's about 1.75 million of unbudgeted and unplanned, and that we have not put into the context of other council priorities. So acquiring additional land for parks or green space has not been an identified council priority up until this point. As we have pointed out with the long-term financial strategy, we are having a hard time finding the money to pursue all of the identified and approved council priorities. So taking this purchase outside of the planning cycle can be problematic. There would be, of course, in the purchase price, but then there are ongoing increased maintenance and enforcement costs associated with the purchase. And as I had indicated, the town center enhancement plan has not been done, so there's been no determination about how this parcel would fit into a larger plan for the downtown.
Councillor Mara?
In regards to the setback, if it was sold to commercial properties, what would be the requirement of the new owner to maintain the riparian, apologize, habitat? Like, what is the requirement for them to keep that natural?
So the property could be transferred currently, and the existing development is essentially grandfathered in. So the existing development would be allowed to remain, but they would not be permitted to do any additional development within that 20-meter setback without requesting a variance. So there's no particular protection we can place on the riparian habitat above what is already currently in place. But the 20-meter setback is intended to do exactly what you are describing, which is protect the riparian habitat. It's why it is included in the land use bylaw, right? So a developer could purchase it, and assuming that the 20-meter setback would be respected, then that would provide the protection for. And that's why in the previous slide I indicated, really you're only left with that small triangle of potentially developable space.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So with that, these are the recommendations that are before you. As I indicated earlier, the recommendation from administration, in general, administration is not supportive of the motion as it is presented for the reasons that have been outlined, and certainly we would have concerns about placing any additional conditions on the property beyond that which is included in the motion. And again, there is a question of the land acquisition policy and the not paying more than market value. If there's a condition that it can only be a park, it's difficult to make the argument that the market value as park is above the $165,000. With that, I will answer any additional questions that you might have.
I have questions that might be better directed to Ms. Van Kempima, if you'd be so kind, because they're financial in nature. So in the report, it does note that if council should move forward with this, the debt funding is an option. And it notes that funding capital expenditures that will benefit future residents through debt is strategic and attains intergenerational equity. I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on the nature of intergenerational equity.
Sure. So there's we've talked about this before, there's different funding sources for things. Your savings account, your piggy bank is your reserves, and traditionally that money comes from current and past taxpayers. Debt, the debt servicing is what costs the taxpayer, and debt servicing costs are in the future, and therefore it's future taxpayers who pay debt servicing costs. So when you're talking about intergenerational equity, you're looking at who's going to benefit from the money that you're spending, and then who's going to pay that money that you need in order to create, acquire, or build the thing that you're needing the money for. So in this case, intergenerational equity is trying not to charge the parents for the children's benefit or the children for the parents' benefit. And that it's getting the generation who will benefit to pay the money it costs to get that benefit. Does that make sense?
Yep,
Okay.
yep, absolutely. It just, some members of this council didn't sit through the property tax bylaw discussions and Bruner discussions. But before you leave, so the recommendation, if we go forward with this, is to consider a 20-year term, 20-year debenture, which is currently at about 3.4% interest, and you indicate that over 20 years it would be, call it $86,000 a year in payments.
Yes, that's correct.
Right, which would represent next year approximately 0.4% of increase to tax demand.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And just so to put that in context, can you remind me what the increased tax revenue was this year from as a result of increased assessment values, not new growth?
0.8%.
0.8%.
From growth, yes.
Right. No, I mean from increased assessment, not growth.
Yeah, oh, you mean market increase?
Yeah, so the current buildings assessed at a higher rate, bringing in additional taxes.
I didn't calculate that.
I didn't think to ask you ahead of time. But
Yeah.
it was more than $80,000 if I recall.
Yes, yes, everyone, but if you're talking about the taxes that are coming from the increased value of someone's property, those are the same taxpayers who were just still there.
True.
The reason why we talk about taxes from growth is because those are new taxpayers, so you're not necessarily adding a burden to someone who was already there. You're bringing more people to help pay for the costs. And that would have been a 0.8% portion of the taxes,
Right, thanks.
or a tax increase.
Councillor McCallum, did you have a question for Ms. Van Kuympema?
For all our outstanding advances.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to, could we back up a couple of slides, please? To that right there, thank you very much. So the funding is $1.25 million in debt, which is equal to $86,000 a year, which means we're going to be paying $1.7 million for this when it's all said and done, before we even put the improvements, the tax receipt, or anything else due to interest over time. Is that my math all right? So could you explain to me what the process would be with regards to the borrowing bylaw? So we would make an offer to purchase, I'm guessing, because we would have to be able to couch the borrowing bylaw into something. Is that how it rolls?
So I'm not an expert on this, but my
that guy
logic
is.
would dictate,
Yes.
I'll let Mike speak in a minute.
So
My logic would dictate that you would actually need an offer before you could go ahead and do a borrowing bylaw, but I
Okay.
would put a condition on the offer subject to the borrowing bylaw.
So that was what I was going to go next. So you would offer, you would be conditional on passing of the borrowing bylaw, and that is, how many days do we require for that?
It's actually about 2.5 months. It wouldn't be till September the 21st that we would have a valid borrowing bylaw, because you have to wait 30 days after third reading in case there's an appeal to the Court of Queen's Bench.
So then we wouldn't actually take possession of that property until 2.5 months later. Yep, they're asking us to pay taxes from June 5th on?
Yeah, I think when the discussion was had with the property owner, my understanding was that they wanted to sell it sooner. However, once it was explained that if we were to finance the purchase through debt, that there would be this 2.5 month period.
Process.
That property owner was willing to wait, but kind of would prefer to, for the purposes of property tax, have the possession date be the date that council makes the decision rather than the actual possession date, because the only difference is because of the way of financing it and the requirements of the borrowing bylaws.
And what happens if the borrowing bylaw doesn't go through?
Well, if you will recall, we had a borrowing bylaw that was appealed to Court of Queen's Bench. And so what we did is we repealed that bylaw and we brought a new one forward for council to consider. And that would be something that we would do in this case, should that happen.
But further to that, if a borrowing bylaw is eventually prevented, or let's say council votes against the borrowing bylaw, or it's challenged in Court of Queen's Bench, and we lose, then in the first case, if council has defeated the borrowing bylaw, then we're in a bit of a difficult situation. The sale at that point, the purchase and sale agreement, which would be conditional upon the borrowing bylaw, would then be expired, right? In the latter case, we could potentially attempt to negotiate with the landowner an extension of the purchase and sale agreement, or the conditions, or the period of time to waive conditions, in order to allow it to come back and to try to do a new borrowing bylaw.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that's the end of my finance questions. Yay. The riparian value of the property. So I recall within my 3 terms, or 2 terms rather, that there were some like pirate bridges that went over the creeks in South Canmore. Does everybody remember that, Mr. Fish? So I remember the pirate bridges, and I remember some, was it Parks Canada came out and was looking at them? Or who's in charge of our waterways and the riparian areas that?
The province.
The province. Okay, so are we being asked in this case to take responsibility for riparian areas that are actually not our responsibility if we were to purchase this land?
No.
Okay.
No. So
I just hear a lot of some of my colleagues talking about the value of it. We should purchase it for the value of the riparian area, but it's not our jurisdiction.
Sure. So the purpose of the 20-meter setback from creeks is to protect, essentially along all water courses, we're trying to protect the riparian habitat. That's the reason why we have the 20-meter setback. That equally applies whether we own the land or whether somebody else owns the land, right? That protection is equally in place regardless of ownership of the land. The reason for the setback is based on, again, provincial guidance that these waterways are sensitive and they should be protected.
Okay. And then when we took a look at the Fairholme property and we looked at that piece of land, which we own, for the purpose of housing, we realized that it was inappropriate because of the rules and the guidelines that we had in place. Would that property be appropriate for a park?
It could certainly be considered at council's discretion.
And it's free.
I blanked out there. What land were you talking about? Across from the seniors.
Seniors Lodge, yeah.
Indeed, the town currently owns that property, and at the current time, the town has determined that development of that property is not appropriate due to the setback requirements and the additional guidance from the province for additional setbacks.
Does it have riparian value?
It does, yes.
Thank you.
Councillor Mara.
Councillor McCallum took part of my question. The other one is, are there other parks identified for future? I know that none are in stone or that have been identified for future parks in the downtown area, close to?
So again, identifying parks or additional land for the acquisition for the purpose of parks has not been an identified council priority. So it is not work that we are currently pursuing. As part of any and all new land use developments, like Three Sisters, for example, obviously we include MR acquisition, and therefore parks is part of that planning process. I think the entire point, again, of the downtown enhancement plan is to look at the downtown comprehensively over a longer period of time and make determinations about what are the facilities and amenities that would enhance our downtown. So that is a component that would be looked at as part of that process. But there's been no determination that there's a requirement for additional parks at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thanks, Mr. Fark, for that information. I just have a question for you about the downtown enhancement plan. When is that scheduled to be done?
So it is currently in the 2019 five-year capital plan. And basically, there were certain things like the implementation of transit that we were looking to have in place, updates to the ITP and the parking plan. And so, assuming that council approves it as part of the 2019 budget, the intent is to move forward with it in 2019.
Okay, so that's fairly soon on the horizon. If this property, I guess there's 2 scenarios or 3 scenarios that we could explore. One is the town buys it, does whatever it's expected to do, which is create a park. The second is for a private individual to buy it, and that private individual would likely not be able to tear down the old house and build a nice new house on the same footprint or the same area because of the closeness to the creek.
Right. So they would not be permitted to tear down the existing house. They could do an interior renovation. They could do a refresh on it, but they could not tear down the building. And then, as indicated in that previous slide, there, new development would be restricted to that triangle at the front of the parcel.
Okay, and the third thing that could happen is it is currently zoned downtown.
Yeah, town center district,
Town
yes.
center district, and they could put a commercial or mixed-use building on that property?
In theory, yes, but again, any new development would have to conform with the current requirements of the bylaw, including the setback. So regardless if it was commercial, a new home, or a mixed use, you're still looking at the same constraints around the 20-meter setback.
Right, but if it was to be a commercial building, then it would have public access to it, correct? I mean, you'd have to have public access if it was commercial.
Yeah, so a commercial use would come with parking requirements and all the other requirements that the land use bylaw applies on a commercial property, yes.
And you'd still have that setback from the riparian. Whatever you did to that property would still have to be in...
If I'm reading your question correctly, you're essentially asking how viable is this property for a use other than an update or a refresh of the existing home. In the opinion of administration, the property is not viable for other development other than to remain as the existing property, or as it is in its current state, with the exception, like I said, of a renovation of the existing home.
Okay, but it is zoned mixed use, so somebody could be very creative and come up with a very creative plan, perhaps ask for variances, right?
They could do those things, yes.
But then it would have to, if it was commercial, it would be public. The fences would come down.
Yes.
You would need public access to it.
So well, I mean, commercial is still private land. Yeah. So no, there would be no requirement, for example, the 20-meter setback area, if a commercial person had, or if a commercial entity purchased the land and they developed on that front triangle, there would be no requirement to make the rest of the parcel available for public access. What they would require is the public entrances to the building itself as per the land use bylaw and parking requirements and those sorts of things.
Okay. Yeah, so they wouldn't necessarily have to build pathways or anything. They could just fence off that section?
In theory, they could. I mean, the existing fence is, again, non-conforming, so it would have to come down, but they could, in theory, do that, yes.
Okay, thank you.
I will note, though, that similar properties with similar constraints were developed through variances approved by the Planning Commission.
So indeed, the building you're referring to is the ISL. I have a hard time understanding how that could have occurred, but it did occur. I think that, again, from administration's perspective, the 20-meter setback is in the land use bylaw for good reason, and that restriction is something that we apply to ourselves and other developments, and it's something that we would like to see and would certainly argue should be maintained in this case.
Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Your Worship. So I just wanted to go back to the very beginning of your presentation, and I didn't really catch it until now. The recommendation that is being provided to council isn't really administration's recommendation.
So the recommendation, the wording of the recommendation is the recommendation on the wording.
It's
but
the
you are,
how-to.
That's right.
Because later in the body of the report, you basically state that this is not in our priorities as a council, and it's not something that we financially planned for.
Yes, and the short story, or the short answer is administration is not recommending this recommendation.
Gotcha.
So for the reasons that we have provided, administration does not recommend moving forward with this purchase.
So just a point, in past times when we've had a recommendation that's come forward that hasn't been really recommended, there's been alternatives. I'm wondering if we ever faced with something like this again, that might be the way forward, because unfortunately to the public, if they were to open this, it could be a bit misleading.
Yeah, so it is a challenge. There's a requirement to word motions in a positive manner.
Positive sense,
right?
yeah. No,
So it's difficult for us to have for a motion that says, you know, that council not approve the purchase of this this parcel. The way to not approve the purchase is to defeat the motion.
Gotcha.
Right? So it is a somewhat awkward wording. I do understand.
Yeah.
We do try to make clear in the body of the report, and
It is stated clearly in the alternative motion.
Yes, and
analysis rather.
I'm often not accused of being ambiguous, so I do believe that the position of administration is clear.
Okay, thank you very much.
Crystal clear. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. I had a question for Ms. Van Kaipiva regarding the finance aspect. When we issue a tax receipt in the amount of $365,000 as per request, does that have any financial implications to us?
No, it does not. There are requirements because we are able to issue tax receipts, that certain things that we have to do and certain things that have to be on there, but there is no financial implications to the town.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions from council? I don't have any other questions either. So thanks for the presentation and for responding to all the questions. So then at this time, I will move that council approve the purchase of 630 10th Street, which has an appraised value of $1.615,000, but to be purchased for $1,250,000 funded by debt, with a tax receipt for $365,000 to be issued to the seller. And further, that council acknowledges that the purpose of purchasing the property is to convert it to a park. And I'll speak in support of the motion. I've been supportive of this discussion since it was first raised last summer, when the owner identified his interest in selling the land to the town to be used as a park. Previous council discussed it briefly and agreed that it should come back to a newly elected council because the election was imminent. So it's taken some time to get here, but throughout all that time, I've continued to see a real positive benefit from stepping outside of our comfort zone on this and doing something that wasn't in a business plan specifically, although I will note that although increasing park space has not been identified as one of council's strategic priorities, increasing livability of the town is. And I'm arguing, one of my arguments is that by creating an oasis on Policeman's Creek and the town center district, we are increasing livability, particularly for future generations. This is an opportunity that doesn't come along very often. In fact, in my memory, it's never come along before. So it is unusual. I think we all know, though, that if we put ourselves out 20, 30, or 40 years, which is council's job to imagine what the future of the community holds, the town center will be more densely built out. 10th Street will likely look a lot like Main Street. Main Street will probably be more dense in terms of number of commercial and residential units. So in 20 or 30 years, the town center is going to be much more densely developed than it is now. And to maintain that, and I called it a little jewel or oasis because I think it is, to maintain that as a park for future generations is recognizing the vision, recognizing our job as council to have a vision for the future of our community outside of our immediate needs. And that certainly must have been what informed council's decision in the late 90s. I don't remember the actual year, but when the opportunity presented itself for the town to purchase the 3 lots on Main Street, which are now a well-loved, cherished little park, well, where the Northwest Mounted Police barracks are. And I haven't been able to track down minutes of those particular meetings, but I understand that those 3 lots were purchased by the town at full market value. I've heard it suggested that if the owner of this property was genuine or really determined to see his property become a legacy as a public park, he should give the land to the town. It seems to me that's an unreasonable suggestion. The fact that the owner is prepared to forego $400,000 in value on the land, I think is a very generous offer on his part. I can't think of any other. Well, Mr. Turcotte in Silvertip has offered some generous support to various town or community interests in that way. But and we spoke during the discussion with administration about the intergenerational equity of such a purchase. And given the vision that I'm trying to argue to, funding of an acquisition like this through debt is perfectly reasonable, given that it's the future residents of the town who enjoy the park that will be paying for the park over time. So I will support this motion, and I hope that I see support from other members of council. Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, I also see this land acquisition as a good opportunity. The negotiated price I was considering was around 1.2, so 1.25 is pretty close to that. This is also an opportunity for council to value green space and convert a downtown property to a park. Its location, mature trees, and creekside setting make an attractive consideration. And when I looked at the reasons to purchase versus the reasons not to purchase, I found more value in the reasons to purchase, including the need for additional pedestrian space in the downtown center. So for those reasons, I will support this.
Anybody else speaking to the motion? Councillor Comfort.
So I've had a difficult time with this one. I was joking earlier that it was an angel sitting on one shoulder, which is his worship, and the other shoulder was the devil's advocate, and I have no idea who that was. I got a little idea about that. So yes, it's a beautiful property, there's no question. And I have a concern that if it were to be bought by a private developer or a property owner, that they would then be requesting variances, and we would see, it's entirely possible, we would see the kinds of variances that gave us the ISL building. My vision would be to have a trail all the way along the riverside that is set back to preserve that riparian habitat and to keep that distance from the creek or from the river. But there's no way to absolutely guarantee that. I have a difficulty with the unplanned expense, and our CFO has spent a long time trying to bring us into line with fiscal responsibility and to really understand the impacts of our decisions like this. So I think that I'm pretty close to making my decision, and I think that I'm not going to be able to support this recommendation because there's so many unknowns going forward, and we're struggling to pay for the capital projects that we know are ahead of us. And if we don't have an option, because we've done this, I think that would be short-sighted. So I think I'm not going to be able to support it.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. This is a really difficult one. It's a beautiful piece of land, absolutely beautiful. And it has that riparian factor. Committing to making it a park is, I think, the challenge. We lose all our options if we buy a piece of land with those stipulations. When I first saw the map, I thought that the riparian zone was essentially through the middle of the building, or the setback. The 20-meter setback was something that would have been at that point of the building, but now that I see the new actual 20-meter setback, it indicates to me that there's a lot more protected land on this property than I had originally expected. The big distinction, I think, between this one and the Northwest Mounted Police Barracks purchase was that the Northwest Mounted Police Barracks, the intention was to preserve that as a provincial historic resource. And in order to do that, the town had to purchase it to make that historic, to declare the historical value, or work with a landowner, but that's always difficult because landowners, property owners often like to do what benefits them with their property, but in the police barracks situation, the town had identified that as something that was going to be a provincial historic resource and work towards that goal. In this particular case, you know, the building doesn't have that kind of interest or distinction to us, so it's essentially the land that we're being asked to consider. I found it a little bit odd that there was a tax relief being asked for until this land is, until the negotiation would be complete, or that the funds would be forwarded through a borrowing bylaw. When this property first came up for consideration, we had funds in the MR reserve, and I thought that would have been a good place to access the funds from. But having to move this to a debenture borrowing bylaw concerns me because, you know, borrowing is something that we do take quite seriously, and it's something our residents pay attention to. You know, are we borrowing the right amount of money for the right reasons? And having to initiate a borrowing bylaw concerns me on this particular property. So at this point in time, I'm concerned about supporting this, just given the challenging nature of the conditions that are placed on this, because there's a lot of conditions that we're being asked to meet. And it would be a grand and wonderful purchase, but with the conditions, I think that I would decline supporting this at this time.
Councillor Hillstead.
Thank you, Your Worship. It is a very nice piece of land, but again, I have the same issues with the financing. As a park, it's $165,000 value. We're being asked to pay 1.25, and then we have to tear down all the buildings and then put other construction costs into it, and we are estimating 320. It could very well go higher. I think it's bad timing. We don't have the money right now, and I don't think we should be borrowing for it. So with mainly those financial issues in mind, I will not be supporting this.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Well, I will agree with you. I didn't have a chance to tour it like some of you, but it is a beautiful piece of property, and the natural state that the shoreline is in is actually like that because the public has been left out. That's actually the reason why it has been preserved so beautifully. It is an expensive proposition at, I think I calculated around $5,700 a square meter of developable land. As mentioned before, if we want to look at a larger park area somewhere central to the community, central to downtown, not bottlenecked necessarily by 10th Street, we could certainly look at those lands on Fairholme because we know that they are not of use to us for housing in the future. So I would like to see the town center enhancement plan, and I think that completed before we made any large capital decisions like this. That being said, I believe that the debt structure proposed, if we were to move forward with this, is the right way to go. I think that if this were to pass, that to borrow for the 20 years would be the right way, that generational equity piece. That being said, as pointed out, that's $468,000 worth of interest before we even tear a building down. I think that every single one of us received a letter in the last 24 hours from the downtown BIA, basically stating that their membership is not in support of the purchase of this land, that they would like to see other improvements move forward prior to laying out dollars like this for a piece of property downtown. And they had mentioned some ideas as well, but at this point I would not be able to support this recommendation.
Councillor Mara?
Thank you, Your Worship. I too was like Councillor Comfort, sitting there looking at this beautiful property, thinking it would be great to have, but I agree with all my fellow councillors. The timing is not great for this, and trying to keep our debt down. And I did identify earlier that we did own the land across from the senior center on Fairholme Drive, and looking at that property maybe in the future, and that we still are looking at doing our downtown or town center plan is still to be developed. So at this time I could not support it. Thank you.
Well, I could debate many of the points made. I'm not sure there's any value in debating them. Just for the record, in response to Councillor Comfort's suggestion that we're struggling to pay for capital projects, I would disagree with that characterization. I think our finances are in very good shape, and to suggest that we're struggling to pay for capital projects, I think is not accurate. But Councillor Comfort, you wanted to respond to that?
If I could respond to that, didn't mean to imply that we were in any kind of difficulty. I just meant to, I was thinking in particular of the CRC and how we had to sort of parse that to get that project underway, and there were certain things that we had to forego in order to get moving, go forward with it. And I would have difficulty explaining to folks that were very passionate about the needs there, how we came up with this money and we couldn't come up with that money. And I know they're not totally analogous, I get that, but there's some logic to that. So sure. That's all I was thinking of. We're in great shape, and we know that, so.
We're in great shape.
We are in great shape.
There you go. Okay, not to belabor the point, I'll call a question. Those in support of the motion? Those opposed? Motion's defeated with Councillor Seeley and the Mayor in support. And I'm going to call a short break now, even though it's not quite 7 o'clock, because I need to. Okay, we're now on to item G2, request for a refund of municipal property tax penalty. Ms. Van Kuympima.
Bless you, Councillor Comfort. Good evening, Your Worship, members of Council. I'm before you this evening to present a request from a taxpayer who incurred penalties due to a late payment of the 2017 taxes. So I'll give you a little bit of history. So in February of 2016, the taxpayer purchased the property from the developer. On June the 15th of 2016, the property owner paid the property taxes by check to the Civic Center. In June of 2017, the tax notice for the 2017 taxes went out. That was due on June the 30th. On July the 12th, our tax department issued reminder letters to those people who had not paid the 2017 taxes. And this property owner sold their property in October of 2017. At that time, their lawyer informed them that the property taxes and the accumulated penalties to that point of $474.55 had not been paid. That taxpayer, or the property owner, came in immediately and paid the taxes and the penalties. Then in April of this year, we were contacted by the former property owner to say that she had just received the letter from us dated July the 12th, stating that the property taxes were unpaid. At that time, she contacted our department. We had explained that we send the letters out. The former property owner is concerned because she did not receive the letter in a timely manner, and for that reason incurred extra penalties. So for that reason, she is asking council this evening to refund her a total of $342.73 for the penalties that were incurred after the reminder letter went out. And I would welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you very much. So if I understand the timeline, the town sent out the letter in July of 2017. The previous owner, the transaction or the transfer of title occurred in October?
That's correct.
So presumably up until October, the previous owner was the person collecting mail delivered to that address?
That would be my assumption, yes.
Mm-hmm. But it seems that the new owners received the mail in April.
Yes.
So of all the tax bills that were mailed out by the town in July, how many others were not delivered that we know of until April of this year?
I'm not aware of anyone. Let me put it this way. No one else has contacted the town to say that they didn't receive their reminder, July of 2017 reminder letter in April of 2018.
And the tax notice was properly addressed and...
Yes, that was the first thing we did, is make sure that both the tax notice and the reminder letter had the correct address, and the person making this request confirmed that that was the correct mailing address.
Thank you. Councillor McCallum.
So it's my understanding from the briefing document that the person was not on tips.
No, and had never been. So we do have two different types of automatic withdrawals for the payment of taxes. We have one that's the tip program, which is a monthly program. We also offer an automatic debit on the due date of taxes each year. And I confirmed today that this particular person was not on that automatic withdrawal. So I did go in to find out how the 2016 taxes were paid, and that's how I ascertained that it was by check brought to the Civic Center.
They've had this property for a while, so they've paid the same taxes every year, not the same tax amount, but taxes are due around the same time pretty much every year.
This particular property, this taxpayer acquired it in February of 2016, but from the submission, my understanding is this person has owned other properties in Canmore and has paid taxes.
Gotcha. And are I know that we can get our water bills by email. Just as an aside, do we have the option of getting our tax bills by email as well?
Not up until recently when the MGA changes came into
Yeah.
place. So before we couldn't, by legislation. Now we can by legislation, but we can't by software. So we're going to be working on that.
That's tricky. Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Hillstead.
So it was just the late tax penalty that they didn't, or notice that they didn't receive, but they did receive their other notice?
Correct.
Okay.
That's my understanding.
Okay. That's all I wanted to know. Thanks.
Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just along the same line of questioning to Councillor Hillstead's. So the MGA never allowed us to send an email reminder of the taxes?
At that time, no. Not necessarily, you can't send an email reminder, but we do have over 12,000 tax rolls, and so our practice has not been to see who we have emails for and not emails for and who's paid and not paid. We do have an automated system within the software that allows us to have the software prepared an unpaid letter, unpaid balance letter, and that's why we do it that way and send it by letter. Right now our software does not allow email, so it would be a heavily manual process, and that's why that's not been undertaken in the past.
Okay, and same thing with the phone call. They mentioned not receiving an email or a phone call.
That's correct. That has never been our practice because of the sheer volume, and I have one person who's the tax officer.
Sure, okay, thanks.
Are there other questions from members of council at this time? Seeing none, thanks very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
And then I will move the council uphold the full $474.55 in penalties applied to roll number 21712 for late payment of 2017 property taxes. And I'll support the motion. Given that any failure of process was, it seems, was in the bailiwick of Canada Post, so the town mailed out, how many did you say, 12,000 tax notices? And as far as we know, one wasn't delivered until April of this year. I would suggest that, as unfortunate as that is for the taxpayer, it's if they have a beef, it should be with Canada Post, in my opinion. So I'll support the motion to uphold the full amount of penalties. Other councillors speaking to the motion? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. This property owner indicates that they owned a house in town for 10 years and never missed a payment to the town. So they must have been aware that the tax payments are due on June 30th. And to not realize that their taxes are due until October seems really odd. Anyway, it just seems like a confusion. I don't really even think it has anything to do with Canada Post. I think it's just somebody missed the deadline to pay their taxes and didn't realize it for a few months and then incurred the penalties. So I would have to say that we should uphold the penalty because I don't think it really has anything to do with the reminder or the original penalty, because they missed the tax payment due date of June 30th, which they would have been paying on another property for 10 years. So most of us do it once and then we never do it again because we know how important June 30th is, or we go on the TIP program. So anyway, I would tend to uphold the penalty motion.
Are there councillors wishing to speak to the motion? Seeing no interest there, I'll call the question. Those in favour? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on then to item G3, Explore 2026 Principles. Ms. Dinash.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. For the benefit of our multiple online viewers, I'm Robin Dinaj, I'm the Communications Manager. I'm here tonight to request that Council adopt the previously presented Explore 2026 principles to guide decision makers as they consider participating in a potential Olympic bid for the Winter Games. To provide some background information on how the principles were developed, as directed by Council, public engagement was conducted between February 5th and April 12th, 2018. And then on March 13th, Council was provided with an update on the first phase of public engagement activities to understand the public's concerns and priorities, as well as their perceived benefits and opportunities. This information was used to create the draft principles. And then on May 8th, Council was provided with an update on the second phase of public engagement activities to hear the public's evaluation of those draft principles to ensure that their values were captured. And this feedback was then integrated with the work that Council did earlier this year during their strategic planning to identify the preliminary principles. That information was used to create the recommended principles. Since Council didn't provide direction to change any of the proposed principles that were presented on May 8th, the same principles have been brought forward tonight for your approval. However, at the last update to Council, Councillor McCallum had indicated a concern with aligning Council's guiding principle of acknowledge and mitigate the impact to locals from added attention and attraction of visitors. So the concern was aligning it with the recommended principle of creating economic diversification opportunities that improve living wage job opportunities for residents. And we agree with that perspective, and felt that it aligned more closely with the recommended principles. So we've updated the report on the website to reflect that suggestion. So on to a quick overview of public engagement. We were very pleased with how the public participated in the process. A total of 1,234 participants took part in the 2 surveys, 2 open houses, and stakeholder meetings and workshops. In addition, there were 3,596 views of our web pages, and our Facebook posts on Explore 2026 were clicked on or commented on 1,346 times. Adding those 3 pieces of the pie together, there were 6,176 times when we engaged with the public through a variety of means. When talking about future public engagement, the BidCo that's being formed in Calgary will take the lead on information sharing in advance of Calgary's plebiscite on the potential Olympic bid. And so back to the principles. As a reminder, a principle is a fundamental intention that serves as the foundation for a chain of reasoning. The Explore 2026 principles were designed to provide general direction for future decision making and to clarify they are not goals that have measurable targets. The intent behind creating these principles is that they can be used by Canmore's leaders to help evaluate the community's participation in a possible bid for the 2026 Games. But these principles do not in any way presuppose that a bid will occur. And these principles can be used as a guide for decision-making in the short and the long term. They're intended to stand the test of time, but of course can be adapted if required. The foundation statement and 9 Explore 2026 principles reflect the collective input from both the community and council and can be used to guide decision makers as they face upcoming issues in the Olympic bid exploration process. And just a quick note, while the public was asked to help prioritize the original set of principles, the principles you see here underwent a significant evolution as I walked you through on May 8th, and so the principles as listed don't reflect any particular order of priority. With that, We recommend that council adopt the Explore 2026 principles to guide decision makers as they consider participating in a potential Olympic bid for the 2026 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Just a couple of sort of generic sort of questions, I guess. So the wording of the proposed motion, it might be that council adopt the principles to guide council. I mean, council are the decision makers, or is the expectation that other decision makers would be referring to these guiding principles?
I see it as other decision makers using these principles, not just council. As an example, as Ms. DeSoto sits on the BidCo, she may have decisions to make that are within her power to make, and that she would also be guided by these principles as she looked to make decisions.
Yeah, fair point. And just as sort of a general observation, I suppose, on the principles that are recommended in the foundational statement, and I appreciate the process we've gone through to get here, but the principles are to some extent aspirational. I mean, if you take them at their face value, I mean, for instance, looking at number 4, you know, it talks about setting a new global standard by hosting the greenest games in history. Well, that's aspirational, which is, it's a worthwhile principle. I support that as a guideline, but it's entirely aspirational. We would hope that we could achieve that, but when it comes to the decision-making time, the decision makers won't know with certainty that the games would be the greenest games in history. It'll be post games that we have that understanding, but it's informing the, as you've noted, it's informing the decision makers.
And sorry, were you looking for my thoughts on that, or that was just an observation?
Well, yeah, I threw that out there to hear your perspective.
Okay. My perspective is that we should be guided by the highest principles that we can set for ourselves. And this isn't about setting the bar low or at a medium level, but we know that the community has significant concerns that they told us and they have concerns that it's our responsibility to ensure those concerns are captured in a way that will help mitigate those concerns. There is a concern about the environment when it comes to hosting the games, and writing this principle in the way it was written, while there may be a criticism that it is aspirational, I think that it behooves us to set the bar high.
I don't disagree. I like the fact that you used the word behoove. It's a word I tend to throw out. I always laugh when I use the word. You're right. It does behoove us. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for the presentation and for summarizing these, I'm not going to say goals, but the foundational statements. When I think about hosting the 1988 Winter Olympics, there were some structures and buildings that were put up temporarily. One of them was the Athletes' Village, correct? They built an Athletes' Village, they used it for the term of the Olympics, and then they removed it all. If we're looking at moving towards these objectives, we would have done something different. We would have built an Athletes' Village, and we would have planned that to be a legacy. Is that what I'm to understand from your number 2, achieve the legacies to resolve community challenges?
Yes, and while it doesn't specifically talk about building an athletes' village that we can convert to affordable housing, it is broader and looking at a number of legacies that achieve our community challenges. And we know today our challenges are around affordability and accessibility, especially when it comes to housing. But the principle also stands if there are new challenges that our community may face in the coming years, and looking at what legacies we can put in place to resolve those challenges. But yes, specifically in the back of our minds, we're thinking about looking at an athletes' village, helping to address our housing challenge.
And so we wouldn't look at building a temporary facility or a temporary structure that we could use in the future. I mean, I don't know what we were thinking in 1988, but we let all that go. So, you know, we made a completely different decision then. Didn't seem to be something that we had to aspire to, but now we're looking at that saying, hey, if there's something that could be left over, if there was something that we acquired through a process that we could use in the future, we wouldn't just say, oh yeah, take it away.
That's correct.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a good one to have in there, thank you.
Councillor Comfort?
Yeah, I also, I really like the one about the greenest games ever, and I think that's a good filter or screen to have for those decisions. But I just have to take issue with you on the Athletes Village as it was in '88. We didn't make that decision. We didn't say take them away, make it temporary, any of that. That was ATCO trailers, brought them in, and then sent them to Fort McMurray and other work camps. So we weren't a big part of that decision. And in fact, until about 10 to midnight, the day before the decision was announced, that Athletes Village was going to be at the Banff Center in the residences there. So it's something I keep in mind as I follow this process along, is how much control and input do we actually have? I think we're going to have more this time than we did back then, but I'm dubious, cynical a little bit, yeah. But so these principles are great. I'm happy that they're aspirational.
Are there other questions for Ms. Dinaj? Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Your Worship. Unfortunately, the press left. It's a shame because I think that the report is quite good, as I outlined in Committee of the Whole. And I think that the traveling, how we got to where we are, is actually really important for the community to see. And I don't know if there's like a cheat sheet we can put out moving forward. I'm not trying to put new things on your plate, but I think it helps people understand what it is we're exactly trying to encapsulate, because all people are seeing are the principles, not what we're expecting to get from those principles, or our hopes and aspirations from those principles. So I just wanted to say that up front. But I'm glad that Councillor Comfort brought up about themes that are outside of our control, because there was something that was brought up during Committee of the Whole with regards to clean sport, and I believe that some of the feedback that you received from participants was that we should take out themes that were outside of our control, and many of these things could be considered outside of our control. So I just wanted my colleagues to understand that I'm going to be putting a motion forward to insert that back in about clean and ethical sport when we approve this, and we'll see what kind of approval it gets. And I just wanted to comment that it's my understanding that with challenges moving forward, that unless what we're looking for and what we negotiate, or what Ms. DeSoto negotiates, if it's not in the multi-party agreement, it's not happening. So we should be very careful as to the expectations we put out there in terms of what new challenges arise. Because once that, unless I'm wrong, Ms. DeSoto, once that multi-party agreement is signed, what's in there, if it's not in there, it's not necessarily happening. So we should be very, very cautious as to what kind of expectations we provide the public.
Ms. DeSoto?
If I may just respond to that. Yes, Councillor McCallum, and I'm certainly learning a a lot as we go, and these discussions evolve and take shape. So the multi-party agreement is really around the financial aspects of the various government partners. Who commits to what, at what percentage, et cetera. So a number of, it's really about the dollars and cents.
But what those dollars and cents are paying for, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. In a very broad scape, so not necessarily down to the very details, although various funding partners may insert conditions that haven't been traditional in past multi-party agreements. But yes, that's my understanding, is the multi-party agreement is the commitment of government parties to what they will fund, when they'll provide the funding, what their conditions of funding are.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Dinaj.
Are there other questions at this time from members of council? Seeing none, thank you very much. With that, I will move council adopt the Explore 2026 principles to guide decision makers as they consider participating in a potential bid for the 2026 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games. I'll pause for a little bit there because I'm expecting an amending motion. Councillor McCallum.
And so since they were in no particular order, I put Principle 10 here as you had outlined. And it hasn't been until my children are reading my notes that I've realized how bad my handwriting is. But it's basically inserting one of the draft principles from our Phase 1 engagement, which was leveraging Canmore's Olympic legacy to set a leading standard throughout the process towards clean and ethical sport. And we've had some members of our community who are Olympians really affected by unethical and unclean sport through the Olympics. So I know that everyone here knows Becky Scott's and Sarah Renna's story, and to be robbed of a gold medal would be absolutely devastating, I think, and the opportunities that come with that as well. And I know that these are all aspirational, understanding that, but I think that this is something that we should demand through whatever leverage that we have through the BidCo and through whatever decisions we make as a council. And so I'm putting this forward and hoping for your support.
It says to set a leading standard. Is that what that says?
It's exactly what was in the report. Leverage Canmore's, actually I deleted living because I didn't understand what that meant, but leverage Canmore's Olympic legacy to set a leading standard throughout the process toward clean and ethical sport. So that's lifted exactly from administration's report. Pardon? Yeah, and I took that out because I didn't know what that meant. So that's the one thing that I did take out.
Can you have games instead of process? Do you mean process? Standard throughout the games?
But it says here throughout the process. I took it from the...
I know, but you wrote games.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, please. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So that's a friendly amendment from administration?
Thank you. I'll totally take that.
So that changes it. I was kind of interested in it before, but leverage Canmore's Olympic legacy is a leading standard throughout the process.
now I've lost him. Great.
Throughout the process.
Thanks, Sally. No, I'm joking.
You don't have to accept that as
It's
friendly.
fine. No, I purposefully wanted to lift it from the report so that I wasn't inserting anything new, really.
So which process does this motion of yours refer to?
The process of, we were talking about the Olympics, right?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So the games are the games, and then there's a process that puts the games in place.
Throughout the process. So what I read from that report, the process being the process leading up to the games, the process of the games. So basically our entire involvement Which these principles are meant to be decision-making principles, correct? Sorry, principles for the decision
Yeah.
makers to guide or lead.
So I'm with you on the page of setting a high or leading standard throughout the games.
Got a friendly amendment, John?
I'm working my way there. Did you have something to add? Your light's on here. Well, you can't.
I know I can't.
Sorry.
Seeing
know
as
how that
Sally
happened.
did, I thought throughout the games planning and delivery process. The process is regarding the games. There's a planning process and there's a delivery of the games, so it's through that. Just to add
So
more.
through the games planning process and delivery of the games, is that what you just said?
Throughout the games planning and delivery process.
Okay, throughout the games planning and delivery process. I wonder if we could see that on the overhead.
I guess this is also what I was talking about when it comes to our reputation, about trying to preserve our reputation as a community and with regards to the Olympics. Motion by committee.
Yeah, I can support this amendment. Don't think I need to go into great detail why. I agree with you that Canmore is well positioned because of our strong base of Olympic athletes who are world leaders in dealing with the scourge of doping. And I think Canmore, and I've talked about this publicly in the context of the Paralympics, how Canmore is well positioned to be a leading voice in support of the Paralympics and the importance of the Paralympics as a part of the whole thing. And I agree that we have the similar sort of leverage that we could bring to bear through our Olympic legacy, particularly the athletes that live live here and operate within that sphere still. So I'll support the amendment. Councillor Hillstead?
Ditto.
It's a good thing that I'm so descriptive when I speak, and you don't have to stretch your mind. You could have said, Mr. Mayor, you're brilliant in the way you've characterized that, so. Anybody else that cares to speak to Councillor McCallum's amending motion? Councillor Comfort?
I thank Councillor McCallum for making this motion, and as someone who has been involved very peripherally with international sport for decades, I really applaud the notion. I don't know how much leverage we have, but I know that our athletes would certainly appreciate it. And you're right, it's devastating for those who have been affected by this. So I thank you.
Anybody else care to speak to the amending motion? If not, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Back then to the initial motion as amended, that we adopt now the 10 principles. Is there discussion on that motion? The amended motion? Not surprisingly, I'll speak briefly to that. So council and the community, all of us have been, we all have a number of questions regarding what it might mean to the town of Canmore to agree to host or co-host 2026 games. And we're all waiting patiently to hear some answers or to start to get the information that we need in order to make a good decision for our community. And this set of 10 principles now, I think, provide a really strong lens, a really Canmore-centric lens through which council can consider the information and the proposed bid details that come forward and make a decision that meets the expectations of our community. So I'm happy to support these 10 guiding principles. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. As I've said before, I'm quite proud of our public consultation through this process, and those numbers were actually quite interesting because they really speak to the amount of people who chose to weigh in on the question of, if we host the games, what is important to us? And so I'll be happy to support these principles, but I would like to remind council that I'm still keen to have a discussion, not a plebiscite, but a discussion farther down the road about whether we actually think the games are good for our community, and that would be a thoughtful discussion. And so I am waiting, I'm not sure I'm waiting so patiently to hear from our colleagues down the highway anymore, quite frankly. I'm really looking forward to them because we're the smallest player in all of this, and we seem to be fairly organized for being the smallest player with the least resources. Yeah, I look forward to having that overall discussion, hopefully before November, because I don't think I would like our thoughtful discussion influenced by what is going to happen down the highway when they make their yes/no decision. So, but I look forward to supporting this, and will too.
Coincidentally, I said something very similar to some of that which you just said when I met with the Minister of Tourism yesterday. I did point out what a great job the town of Canmore has been doing on this whole file.
I pointed that out to a few city councils
Yeah.
the weekend as well.
Yeah, no criticism intended, but we've been doing a good job thanks to administration and a number of other factors. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. I think this is a good direction for us to go. I will be happy to support this, and I'm still very open to the concept of what this will look like for us. As we go forward, I think we're embracing the process step by step. If there's a time when we need to diverge from that, I would be open to that as well. But at this point in time, I think we need to go forward with a positive attitude and with support for administration, because we are involved quite intently by appointing Ms. DeSoto to that committee. You know, I think our interests are being put forward, and also I think these are good aspirational foundational statements that we can keep in mind when we're negotiating, because I think we are part of the negotiation. We're negotiating on behalf of our community, and we've heard from our community. We will continue to hear from our community, and when opportunities arise, we should be poised to accept them and take them with these aspirational goals. So I would be happy to support this, and I think you've done a really good job of getting input from the community as to how to move forward with this, because we're involved whether we have the opportunity to contribute our aspirations or not. I mean, if we're involved on a peripheral basis, we may get what we get. If we're involved as a good, solid player, we may get what we want. So I would be happy to support this direction.
Are there other members of council who would like to speak to the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor, Opposed, motion's carried unanimously. Fabuloso. Okay, take that to the board. Moving on then to item G4. And there's a public presentation. And then in camera, is that how this is planned? Mr. Fark? So we'll have some public conversation, and then once that's done, we'll move in camera for a little more conversation. So what's with the white on black?
Ask Andreas.
Oh. Would have understood if it was plaid, you know, white on plaid. That would be Andreas.
Mm-hmm.
He's using white. Oh, okay. All right.
Good evening once again, Mayor Borman, members of council. So we are here now this evening to just have a short discussion around Mountain Haven Co-op and a recommendation coming forward from administration. So the recommendation that is before you is that council approve a transfer of $250,000 from the PAH reserve to CCHC in order to implement the actions and activities required to transition Mountain Haven Co-op to a CCHC managed PAH development. Motions aren't short anymore, you know?
I've seen way worse than this.
Yes, indeed. Maybe even this evening, in fact. So,
carry on.
So, previous council direction, just to refresh. So last summer, this issue was also before council, and there was some discussion at that point in time. Council directed administration to work with CCHC to explore the possibility of acquiring 17 units from Mountain Haven in order to essentially address the debt issue and to, again, move this into a PAH development. That process continued for some time, and unfortunately, a resolution that would result in the acquisition of the units by CCHC was not possible to come to through the process that was previously conducted. So as a result of that conclusion, the town, CCHC, and Mountain Haven have been working diligently together since then to bring forward an alternative plan and to come to a new way of bringing this to a positive resolution for all parties involved. So that process resulted in the creation of a roadmap for how to transition Mountain Haven into a CCHC PAH managed program. And this is sort of a high-level synopsis of the steps that are required in order to accomplish that. The first one was to eliminate the restrictive grant conditions that were provided or that came attached to the development when it was first constructed. That has been accomplished. So the CAO was able to lead good discussions with the province and negotiate to have the grant agreement amended to essentially have the term already have been expired. So that has been successfully done. The next is to restructure the PAH requirements contained in the CCHC ground lease to obtain Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation approval. This is in principle done at a high level. So CCHC, Managing Director, worked together with CMHC, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, to develop a lease that was CMHC acceptable. Now that lease applied to the Larch project. And so for each project, CMHC reserves the right to review it as it applies to that particular process or that particular project. But in principle, we have agreed with CMHC that a leasehold model is possible, and we have a leasehold document that they are comfortable with. Again, with the caveat that if we go to apply it at Mountain Haven, CMHC would again reserve the right to review it at that time. But the second point is essentially, at a high level, has been addressed. The next three steps are essentially the roadmap, the steps that are before us that still need to be completed. So we need to convert the cooperative to a condominium corporation. We need to sell the 17 units to discharge the debt obligations. We need to dissolve the corporation, the cooperative, and form a condominium corporation. So those are the steps that, sorry?
That's the royal we.
Yes.
Not we, the town of Canmore, but
yes.
Somebody has to make that occur.
That is correct. I am using the royal we. I apologize. So the by that we mean this process needs to be led by Mountain Haven, but it needs to be supported by CCHC and by the town. Under this proposed process, the funds would actually be provided to CCHC, who would then have oversight over the disbursement of those funds and how they are spent in support of accomplishing the roadmap process. So, what are the next steps? So, Mountain Haven has appointed a consultant to lead the essentially condominium conversion process. And then there will be work by Mountain Haven, by the town, and by CCHC to support that conversion process and the remaining steps in the roadmap. So that concludes my presentation for the public section. I'm happy to answer any questions now, or if you prefer to move in camera and proceed from there.
Are there any questions for Mr. Fark at this time? Councillor Sanford?
I'd like to ask this question. I'm not sure if it's more appropriate to ask in camera, but the sale of those 17 units that are currently on the books of Mountain Haven Co-op, they're currently in a rental pool, is that correct?
That is correct.
But if those 17 units are sold to individuals, or that's what I'm expecting, there would be criteria for those individuals to own those 17 units.
Yes. So the final outcome of this process, the ultimate goal, is to have the entire development, not just the 17, but all 44, become part of the CCHC PAH managed portfolio. So they would be equity units, similar to the equity units that we are providing in the large area, for example, but they would be part of the CCHC process. So yes, those 17 units would still be managed in that way.
So I think one thing that the community has a hard time understanding is that when people buy these units, they're actually getting loans from somebody to bring capital to the table, right? So they're putting money into something that is a capital investment because they own it.
So it's similar to anyone who is acquiring property, right? If you don't have the full cash to purchase the property, then you need to take a loan, but you are in fact acquiring an asset that in theory at least retains its value, if not appreciate in value over time.
So, but the fact of the matter is that this project needs capital and people can bring capital to it through this process.
So this project has, yes, the short answer is yes, this project has some liabilities, some debt essentially, and the purchasing of those units essentially provides cash to pay down debt.
Yeah, so it brings money into the project. So when we sell, or when CCHC sells things, they're actually inviting people to bring money into the equation because they're bringing the money from somewhere, whether it's their own money or loaned money.
Yes. Okay.
So it's a good thing when people actually bring money to these capital projects because...
Yes. I mean, ideally, and for the home equity program, we are encouraging ownership and the capital that brings in. One is because it offsets, in the case of the large project, for example, it offsets the cost to develop the housing, right? So that it frees up capital for CCHC then to apply to future housing projects. And in this case, it frees up capital to pay down debt.
Okay. And then they have to work with the current renters to transition that process?
Yes. So all the same rules for the tenancy applies. The Landlord-Tenant Act would apply here equally to these units as they would for any units.
Okay, thank you.
So part of the goal here is to end up with those 44 units, as Mr. Park was saying, in the PH inventory, largely equity units, although it could be that CCHC manages some of them as PH rentals for a period of time. But one of the important things to bear in mind in these discussions is the results since Hawks Bend in the large area was developed. And the last I heard, there was 41 of the 49 units had been sold. 8 units are not on the market yet, but there's still a waiting list of 100 qualified, or let's say qualified potential owners, 100 applications. So if this process on Mountain Havens can make its way through and end up with 17 or 20, whatever additional equity units, there is a demand for them in place. I think that's important to bear in mind.
And another way of describing the goal of this process outside of the PAH component is marketable title. So currently, right now, it's very difficult to sell any of the units. Essentially, there's no market, there's no ability to sell them because of the current situation and some of the restrictions that are in place. The goal of the roadmap is to result in a situation where those units can actually, not just the 17, but all 44 units, can be bought and sold as any other CCHC product could be bought and sold. And so that is one of the goals of this.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Fark before we go in camera? See none, I'll move council go in camera. Those in favor, opposed, we're in camera.
We are, as soon as the clerk confirms that we are.
on? So at this time then, I'll move that council approve a transfer of $250,000 from the PH Reserve to CCHC in order to implement the actions and activities required to transition Mountain Haven Cooperative Homes to a CCHC-managed PAH development. Speaking to the motion, I'll support this. That's the intent of the reserve. The reserve has been created to fund either the acquisition of land or the development of buildings to meet the demand for affordable housing. While this fund flowing through to CCHC isn't directly attributable to acquiring land or developing a building, it is indirectly, and through this work that the transfer would accomplish, there's a reasonable expectation that we will end up acquiring new PH units in a sense. I mean, transitioning from the cooperative model to PH